New York City. Are you ready to ring in 1984? I'm Rick Rockwell, and you're listening to all the New Year's jams until the ball drops. If 1983 was your year, then cheers to you. But if not, well, here's hoping next year will be.
Cheers. Eddie Antar hoisted his Budweiser in the air, though you wouldn't hear a clink. Antar was alone in the back of his stretch limo on the corner of 80th Street and 1st Avenue, waiting outside the home of his girlfriend, a pretty young blonde named Debbie. Eddie cracked another beer. What was taking so long? It was time to party! There was so much to celebrate. Eddie's namesake company, the electronics retailer called Crazy Eddie's, was getting ready to debut on the New York Stock Exchange, and Eddie was about to be a millionaire, along with most of his family who worked for the chain. He was living a 1980s boss boy fever dream. His name was in every business magazine. Analysts were praising his unique strategies, his endless expanding revenues, and his viral marketing campaigns. That year, a poll would show that 99% of New Yorkers knew about Crazy Eddie's. The store had better name recognition than Ronald Reagan. Finally, the limo door opened, and Eddie dropped his beer in terror.
You balding piece of crap, good for nothing.
Debbie, what are you doing here?
Listeners, let me explain. The woman who opened the door to the limo was Debbie A., his wife of 15 years. Debbie E. was his much younger girlfriend. Eddie had called Debbie A. earlier in the night to call off their New Year's plans. Some lame excuse about a meeting with bankers to discuss the upcoming IPO. But she smelled his BS a mile away and tracked him down. Tagging along was Eddie's sister, Ellen, and Eddie's sister-in-law, Robin. All three women were fed up with Eddie's buffoonery and more wound up than the New Year's Eve ball. They dragged him out of the limo by the hair barely hanging onto the back of his head. The doorman stepped out of the high-rise just in time to see Eddie slap his sister Ellen across the face. The doorman ran back inside to call the police before the limo sped off into the night. Eddie may have escaped that night, but Debbie A. was just the first of many to sniff out Eddie's lies. By the end of the decade, Crazy Eddie was bankrupt, swallowed by accusations of fraud and tax evasion. Eddie would become an international fugitive, and the family who profited from Eddie's crimes, some unknowingly, others knowingly, would turn on him. Just as he had once walloped his own sister, they would retaliate with a proverbial bitch slap, supporting law enforcement's efforts to lock Eddie behind bars. This is the Corporate Gossip Podcast, Crazy Eddie, Fraud Mother?
Hey, this is producer Mike. If you want to binge all of season 4 right now and not have to wait for weekly drops, head over to our brand new Patreon, patreon.com/corporate gossip. All audio and video are up there right now for the entire season. Plus, not only can you binge the entire season, there'll be discussions with Adam and Becca about each episode. So head over to patreon.com/corporate gossip and sign up now. All right, let's get into the show.
Speed.
Welcome back to the Corporate Gossip Podcast. I'm your host, CPA scorned Becca Platsky. I'm here with my brother and my co-host,
Data analytics playboy Adam Platsky.
and a special guest. I'll introduce him in a second. Guys, in order to do this episode right, we need to go to another time and place entirely. Not a boardroom, not a mega yacht, not a private jet. Where we're going is a seedy punk rock paradise. It's covered in graffiti. It reeks of piss. And it's vibrating with possibilities. So throw on your finest baseball tee and your flared denim and join us in 1970s New York City. And we're not just going to describe it. Today, we've brought a special guest who lived in it. He just popped a few ludes so he could really get into the mindset. Please welcome our dad, Jeff Platsky.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for
The ludes?
the audience, the audience for the shout outs in previous episodes.
So
This is a welcome back.
yeah, welcome back.
Thank you.
You were a very highly requested guest. People really like you and they like your perspective. And I think on this one is very special because, like I said, you were there.
I was indeed there.
We'll see how much you remember. So we're going to learn about Crazy Eddie's first store, which was in Brooklyn. But Manhattan is really the birthplace of the businessman Eddie Antar. He got his start selling knockoffs to tourists in Times Square. So This scene, though, is a little bit different. If you've been in Times Square in the past 20 years, what you would have experienced is almost unrecognizable compared to the Times Square of the 1970s. Dad, can you describe to us what he would have been experiencing as, a 14-year-old in Times Square?
It was a hellscape, seedy, dirty. It was just disgusting. And so it had ton of X-rated movie theaters all up and down 42nd Street, 7th Avenue, all over the place. Prostitutes all over the place, especially around Port Authority and the exit of Times Square. It was just, and the prostitutes would ask every passing male, honey, you want to go out? And I'd just say, no,
Yes,
thanks.
please.
I'm going home to mom. The other thing was common in Times Square at that point was 3-card Monte dealers. They'd set up. It was a total scam. They'd set up on cardboard tables, and all these people would gather around, and you try, and it was 3 cards, and they try to guess where the secret card was, and they had it down. But it was every time.
So it was like, you put a ball under a cup
yeah,
and you move around the cup.
But the card never was there.
And they flipped the cards really fast. And but they were all on cardboard tables, so if the cops came, they could scram. So, and the other thing about the subways, graffiti covered. There's not a space that wasn't graffiti covered. It was just, some were good. Most were crap.
Let's move away from the subjectiveness of graffiti. When I think of New York in the 70s, I think of that scene in Big where Tom Hanks is getting his
in the
hotel room.
hostel?
Yeah, and they say, what do they say? They're like, St. Anthony's, see? It's Catholic. How bad could it be? And he's walking through all scared.
That was always a sad scene because he was like away from his mom and scared.
But that's what I think does a good. Do you think that does a good depiction of what Times Square
I think that was the 80s, so it might have been even better then.
I think it was better then. It was already being transformed. I think 70s Times Square is, imagine the worst place in the world, and it was that.
Okay, so what were you up to during that time? And if you're watching us on YouTube, you're going to see a YouTube exclusive, which will also be on the Substack, I suppose. A picture of my dad. How old are you in this picture?
I think that was my high school graduation pictures.
So
from John Bowne High School.
So from Queens, and you were
just turned 17.
So 1970.
1971, yeah. And my friends and I were going down to CBGB's, and we were seeing bands like Television, Talking Heads, and $5 get in, $3 pictures, and we were going down to the Bowery all the time. But so I avoided Times Square. But my friend lived on Houston Street, or First and First. And that was as seedy. The foyer of his fourth floor walk-up, you'd see people strung out in
It's the nexus of the universe, according to Kramer.
Oh, first
and first is where it's where how does the one road intersect with itself?
It was incredible. There were some great bars and clubs down there, like the Tunnel, and there was a bar down there called King Tut's Wawa Hut in Alphabet City. That was just great. The Tunnel, MK's, the clubs at the time.
King Tut's Wawa Hut.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're not on YouTube, Mike, do you want to describe the picture that's on?
No, I'd love to. It looks like you were about to jump into a van with a bunch of other miscreants and spend a decade doing LSD up and down the coast.
Yeah, in a Volkswagen bus.
In a bus, yeah.
Yeah, he's got a mutton chops, shoulder length hair. Honestly, I must say, very shiny, very healthy hair.
Yeah, who's doing your lip fillers?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Those chops are impressive. Or is that a shadow?
No, those are mutton chops.
That's great.
Right?
Those mutton chops.
Was that because you couldn't grow it anywhere else?
They're true.
I had the same ones.
Okay, so we give that context not to just allow Dad to relive his glory years, but also because I think it's critical because it informs Eddie Antar's future. And this influence isn't just a one-off. Like, there's a couple of others who were born around the same time as Eddie Antar and had similar business experiences in 1970s Manhattan. Maybe you've heard of them. Ponzi schemer Bertie Madoff, junk bond king Michael Milken, and insurrection influencer Donald Trump. Luckily, Dad, you got out of the city. Otherwise, and you went upstate to Syracuse. Otherwise, would you think you would have done a little fraud?
Nah, I could have done fraud. I think there were people in my realm that were fraudsters, or let's just say penny ante fraudsters.
This is a story that I first learned when I was getting my master's degree in accounting. And it was like the first time that I realized that fraud could be so silly. The story is like if the characters in Goodfellas existed in an episode of Parks and Rec, or it's like a crossover between Cheaters and Succession. And I'm just so excited to share it with you guys. And here's my hot take about Eddie Antar. And we'll get into my reasons behind this throughout the episode. But I think it would have been impossible for him to not do fraud. It was baked into the culture that surrounded him in New York City and at home in Brooklyn with the members of his family and his community. And when he's confronted eventually by those family members, who some of whom went to jail because of their involvement in this scheme, they say, Eddie, I learned it from you. And he says, you didn't learn it from me. It was in the culture. I'm not saying he's not guilty. I'm not saying he shouldn't have gone to jail, but it's interesting to see somebody operate in retrospect. One of the most pervasive and obvious frauds of the 20th century. And not only did everyone who should have stopped him just turn a blind eye, but they rewarded him. His family, the regulators, the shareholders, the bankers, law enforcement, they reinforced his behavior. They were like happy to feed into the fraud until it stopped working. And that's when everybody threw up their hands and said, oh my God, what a terrible, awful scammer, straight to jail. And, it's hard to do the right thing when you're getting paid to do the wrong thing. And that's really what I think is ultimately the message of this episode. So are you guys ready to dive in?
Let's dive.
Okay. Corporate gossip number 1 is Crazy Eddie, a 1980s amphetamine fever dream. Dad, can you describe what Crazy Eddie's was? What would you find inside of a Crazy Eddie store?
It was a bazaar of electronics. You had speakers, amplifiers, turntables, clock radios. You remember them? CB radios, color TVs.
Consumer electronics. And I mean, I think it's important to point out that this store was actually pretty important to baby boomers who music was everything to them, right? So if we go to the next page, you'll see Queen at their in-store appearance at Crazy Eddie's in New York. It's possible that many listeners of this episode have never heard of Crazy Eddie, but did you know that in 1986, the store had higher name recognition than Reagan? So this name recognition was made possible by the store's advertising campaign, which I guess you could say was the first viral marketing campaign. Why don't you describe these commercials, and then we'll play a clip for the listeners.
There was not a moment that Crazy Eddie commercials could not be heard on one of the multitude of New York radio stations, always with the famous tagline, his prices are insane!
Get a color TV or a Sony Betamax or a TV video game. Get it now, because Crazy Eddie can't be beat. With prices so low, he's practically giving it all away. Shop around, get the best prices you can find. Then go to Crazy Eddie, and Crazy Eddie will beat him. Remember, Crazy Eddie guarantees you the largest selection, professionally staffed service centers, and the guaranteed lowest prices. Crazy Eddie, his prices are insane.
So the guy in the commercial you guys just heard wasn't Eddie himself, although a lot of people thought it was. It was a radio DJ named Jerry Carroll. And here's how the New York Times describes him in a 2016 piece. Carroll appeared in more than 7,500 commercials on radio and television, He dressed as Santa in the winter and again in the summer. He put on a beard and a stovepipe hat, and a moment later, a white wig to honor 3 great Americans, Lincoln, Washington, and Crazy Eddie. It goes on to say he seemed the very soul of bargain basement desperation. He was the carnival barker of the airwaves. Dan Aykroyd actually spoofed him in Saturday Night Live using Carol's style to sell a product called the Bat-O-Matic.
Witches, warlocks, conjurers, sorcerers, black magicians, white magicians. Are you having trouble mixing your potions in time for the winter solstice? Is your sorcery getting hung up because of the hours you spend mixing and blending your remedies? Then you need Ravco's amazing new witch's aid, the Super Bat-O-Matic 77.
I think that this was like, there would be no, what was that guy's name? ShamWow or Billy Mays.
Billy Mays
without Jerry Carroll.
Jerry Carroll, absolutely.
Did you guys read at one point that James Brown actually called the ad agency that managed these advertisements and asked if he could do the voice of Crazy Eddie? I guess he was going through some hard times in his career and, thought this might be an opportunity, but they turned him down. That's how popular.
He should have stuck to being the Godfather. So.
yeah. But that's how popular Carroll was. People would literally line up by the hundreds at store openings just to get his autograph. And that was the genius of Eddie Antar to pick Carroll as the face of the store, because the real Crazy Eddie, I don't think has as much riz. I don't know, listeners, you be the judge. Let's meet the man behind the curtain, Eddie Antar. Let's go to corporate gossip number 2, which is Eddie's villain origin story starts in Times Square. Let's revisit, Dad, what you call a 3-ring circus of unsavory characters, where Eddie, at 14 years old, starts working at a clip joint. Mike, had you ever heard of the phrase a clip joint?
I've never in my life heard that name.
So a clip joint is an underground market that only operates to scam you out of money. And that's where Eddie is working, convincing us unsuspecting tourists that a $25 camera was actually worth $250. He's working under his uncle, Irving Zookie Antar, and Zookie would end up running a Crazy Eddie outpost in the Bronx, and Eddie was doing well at his clip joint operations. Allegedly, he's pulling in $1,000 a week, which I don't know if I buy. That's like $10,000 a week today, but he eventually expands his scam camera operation into a brick and mortar electronics retail store called Sights and Sounds with his father, Sam, and his cousin, Ronnie. And this is where we see kind of the first theme of the story, which is working with one's family. And let's touch down on the family aspect here for a minute. So Eddie was the grandson of Syrian Jewish immigrants from Aleppo. And just as background, between 1870 and 1930, thousands of Jews are moving to New York City from Greater Syria, which was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire, which included Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. So everybody's from that area are moving down. And I'm sure one of Eddie's relatives is in the picture that we're about to show. These are Syrian children arriving in New York in 1910. And God, the turn of the century commitment to dress a 4-year-old boy like a little man is kind of sending me. Anyway, the Syrian Jewish population settled in Brooklyn, in Bensonhurst specifically, and by the 1930s, that they numbered 10,000, which sounds like a big number, but in New York City, it's really not. That's like 10 blocks worth of people. It's super tight knit. Actually, probably less than that blocks, considering how many people they were in one apartment.
Bensonhurst too.
It's probably 5 blocks because they were living probably 8 to an apartment. So super tight knit. I think this was rather common for other ethnic communities at the time, but it was pretty insular. And here's a quote from the book. In the Syrian Jewish culture, relatives were friends in the deepest sense, bound by blood or marriage. In days of prosperity, they were business partners. In times of distress, they were lifelines. Relatives and friends did favors for relatives and friends of relatives and relatives of friends. People took care of each other. They helped each other, and they were compensated in return. And even though Eddie dropped out early from high school, which was really frowned upon in the community, his early business endeavors as a salesman were cultural tradition. Apparently, his grandfather used to say, an Alpine, which is a person from Aleppo, can sell even a dried camel skin, which I don't know. I don't know enough about camel, but I guess that would be similar metaphor to selling ice to an Alaskan. But all that to say, you can like put yourself in Eddie's shoes here. Here's a bazaar in Bensonhurst, 86th Street and Bay 32nd Street in Brooklyn. He's a kid growing up in 2 different worlds. His days are like live nudes And then his nights are like going to synagogue with mom and dad. And I think this is relatable. Maybe not the live nude parts, but at least the feeling of the kind of like cultural conflict to a lot of our listeners who are children of immigrants. The second theme that's kind of cemented for Eddie early in life is the idea that everybody can be scammed. Equal opportunity scammer, including the government. And so when he opens Sights and Sounds with his cousins, they're subject to something called the fair trade laws. I didn't realize that these laws ever existed, but it used to be illegal to sell something at a retailer at a different price than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Do you have any idea, Adam, like these Great Depression laws, why they might have been enacted? So where you wouldn't be able to sell something for anything other than the manufacturer's suggested retail price?
Yeah, I think it was to protect small businesses from wholesalers.
Well, not from wholesalers, but from larger retailers.
Yeah, well, that's a wholesaler.
So like a Walmart wouldn't be able to undercut your local bodega on the same product.
Back in the day, a Sears or a W.T. Grant or something like that. But that was the story of my childhood. I mean, all prices were the same in the 60s.
There was no pricing algorithms to
There was no surge pricing?
Yeah, no.
So the laws were repealed in 1975 because of high inflation. Like a lot of these consumers were like, look, these bigger stores like Sears could offer us these things at a discount, and we're already feeling like we can't afford things. So they repealed them and allowed bigger stores to capture that discount. But Crazy Eddie started in 1971 at Sights and Sounds, and they were like, well, we're offering a discount. So the way that they got around that was basically buying their inventory on the black market and selling them at quote unquote retail price, but getting them at much cheaper. And by 1975, when the fair trade laws were abolished, he was able to put in place the technique that basically became foundational to growing his empire, which was deeply discounting merchandise and making up the profits by stealing sales tax.
Crazy Eddie never advertised prices. He always said, come in with the other guy's price and we'll beat it. So there was no reason for him to put $99.95 on an ad. He just said, we have Sonys, we have Panasonics, we have Fishers, and you come in and we'll beat
Name
the
your
other
price.
guy's price.
That's so funny. He invented price matching because price matching is such a common thing now. If you go to Amazon and you show a receipt that you purchased something or there's something lower, they'll price match. Exporting goods will price match. Price matching is commonplace now. So it's really interesting to hear that he kind of revolutionized that. Here's my question, Dad. How many of Eddie's contacts were mob associates? Because I'm reading this, I'm doing the research, and I didn't see anything about Eddie being mob connected.
I mean, we watched the documentary last night, and Adam talks about a lot of this inventory falling off a truck. I have to believe that.
But then why weren't they, like, squeezing him?
I don't know if he really was. He may have been paying protection. I bet you he was paying protection, but that was the way life in Brooklyn. So
it didn't come up in the book at all.
Yeah.
That's my. Yeah, I guess that was my question.
I mean,
it was a non-issue.
That's crazy. They say that he got his black market merchandise through family connections, which certainly reads very mob-like to me.
Yeah, right.
But there was no specific. Actually, there was one associate that he worked with that I think was with the Genovese crime family, but he was just a salesperson.
Right.
He wasn't,
Interesting. Well, I think
it's very possible back in that time that there could have been bosses involved or underbosses involved, but it wasn't clear. It wasn't. I don't think there has ever been a direct connection between Eddie Antar and the mob.
Okay, mob adjacent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a good term.
Yeah. So Eddie could match whatever price he wanted, no matter what they bought the product for wholesale, because his income was basically guaranteed when you're not paying any sales tax and you're skimming the profits. And by the way, they're doing this in a pretty rudimentary way. They're just buying stuff on the black market, like I mentioned. They're selling it for cash, and then they're stashing the cash wherever they can, under mattresses and the drop ceiling. They'll even tape it to the bodies of family members and cousins. And when they fly over to Israel back home, they deposit it in Israeli bank accounts. It's funny because this feels like an incredibly difficult thing to do now, like avoiding paying sales tax at this scale, at least from like my CPA perspective, because I know all the ways auditors can find out that like tax was avoided. But in the 70s, especially before Sarbanes-Oxley, it's like the Wild West. It reminds me of this joke that John Mulaney talks about where he's like, you know, solving crime before DNA testing in the 1800s. And they'd be like, look, it's a pool of the killer's blood. Gross, clean it up, you know? And it's just like... So if you're a salesman on the floor of Crazy Eddie's, most of whom were Eddie's cousins, and you didn't know that Eddie was stealing from the government, would you think otherwise, that it was a perfectly legitimate operation?
I don't think so.
Probably not. Yeah. Because first off, when you're in the store, and Dad, I don't know if you remember this, having stepped foot in the store, but when you're in the store, Eddie took on the energy of your smelly bubby at the family gathering, and you are not getting out of that gathering without a kiss from Bubby. Except the kiss was a purchase from his store, and he would literally not let people out of the store without buying something. That's how aggressive the salespeople were. Every time, you know, Rube's customers walked in the door at Crazy Eddie, you're marked. The salespeople had their own nicknames for certain types of customers, and here they are. So a Lot A is a crazy guy, a Jedge is a jerk, a Lot 6 is a gay person, a Husho is a shoplifter, a Zaba is a deadbeat, and a Niche is a lowlife. And gay person? Like, do gay people not buy stereos? Okay, so Mike walks in the store. What nickname are you guys giving him out of this list?
Niche.
A lowlife? Okay, so this Niche walks into the store and he wants to buy this Sony CF580 that we have on the screen, which is a handheld boombox that plays tapes. It retails for $400, which, by the way, is $2,500 today. It's crazy how expensive electronics were at the time.
But this was innovative for the time.
I mean, I can't imagine. Yeah, taking a boombox to the park must have been crazy. Yeah. So you go into Crazy Eddie's to buy it, but this unit is so popular that there's only one left, and it's the display model that everybody's grubby hands had already been all over. And normal stores might offer it a discount, but not Crazy Eddie. They had a code for that. You want to describe what they would do?
They'd polish it off, they'd clean it up, they'd put it in a new box with original packaging, tape it up like original, and sell it as new.
Yeah. And so by the 70s and 80s, Eddie's got pretty smooth operation going on. He's not paying sales tax. He's repackaging defective and old merchandise. He's stashing cash wherever he can, which brings us to corporate gossip number 3, which is when it comes to fraud, Eddie Antar is mother. Before I go any further, I need to remind you guys, and I need everybody to say it with me now. Ready?
Okay.
Fraud is bad. Don't do the fraud. Okay, now pause this episode, listeners, and say it to yourself 10 more times. Okay, welcome back. Now I can say what I need to say about the way that Eddie Antar did fraud.
Brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular, never the same, totally unique, completely not ever been done before.
Was that JoJo Siwa talking about her new album?
Yeah. No, that was Lady Gaga. So Sam Bankman-Fried, Elizabeth Holmes, Trevor Milton, you guys are like Steph Curry in the fraud game, but Eddie Antar is Wilt Chamberlain. You like that sports reference?
Yeah,
good sports
very
reference.
good.
Stealing sales tax is child's play. We're about to go professional with this shit as the chain starts to grow and they begin to prepare for an initial public offering. Here's the prospectus. The thing about going public is you need to pass an audit. And you guys better know, as veteran listeners to this podcast, that at this point, this was not going to happen without some serious chicanery on Eddie's part. He did not have a good understanding of the techniques that these auditors was going to use to assess the value of Crazy Eddie, which left him vulnerable. He needed somebody on the inside. And luckily, he had a college-age cousin who hadn't yet picked a major. And that cousin was Sam Antar. And Eddie calls him up and goes, "Hey, Sammy boy, listen, why don't you major in accounting at Baruch and I'll pick up the bill and you can come work for me." So Sam gets his degree from Baruch and then works for a year at the accounting firm that would end up auditing Crazy Eddie, Penn and Horowitz. Sam ends up, this is insane, having control over the audits performed at Crazy Eddie between 1981 and 1984. And at the same time, Sam is also moonlighting as CFO of Crazy Eddie's, though he's being paid off the books and he's not listed on any of the company information.
Do I smell conflict?
Well, that's the crazy thing. These guys have the same last name and nobody thought to like do a cross check. It's not that popular of a last name. So now Eddie's ready to go pro. And this is where things get really fun. So hold on, everybody. Welcome, riders. Put on your seatbelts. Hold on to your wallets. Put your hats away because we're going to go on a new ride at Coney Island, the Crazy Eddie Scam Scrambler. Are you guys ready? Raise your hands and go, whee! Okay, we're going up. Here's Insurance Fraud Hill. You're in New York City in the 1980s. And the one thing you have to know about New York is the infrastructure just dog shit in the 1980s and can't handle the number of people that live there. And that's still true today, but definitely true back then. So if you're a store owner and there's a flood watch, you probably want to move your merchandise out of the basement to protect it. Eddie was like, wait, scratch that, reverse it. When the weather forecast called for a flood, he'd put more merchandise in the basement. A lot of times it was stuff he couldn't sell, so he could get insurance to write him a check. Sometimes he'd even use products that he had already claimed on previous insurance claims in previous floods, and the insurance companies got suspicious and they dropped him, but he would just like get a new insurer.
You know, when you look up the term chutzpah in the dictionary, Eddie Antar's picture is there.
That's why I tell you he is mother, because he's bold, he's never been done before, absolutely amazing.
Over the top.
He slayed this fraud. So other times he knew insurance adjusters in his community, in his neighborhood, and he was like, hey, just sign off this paper and you'll get a kickback for giving me the claim. Okay, hold on, guys. We're going towards fictitious inventory loop. So part of the IPO process is figuring out how to value all the inventory you have so they can figure out what number to put in the assets column in the balance sheet. Normally, auditors show up unannounced to count inventory, but since Sam was working at the firm that was auditing Eddie, he gave him a heads up and they were prepared. They'd have the stock boys stack up inventory like 10 by 10 high, 10 wide, and 10 long. But there'd be nothing on the inside of the box. So it'd look like you had 100,000 boxes of inventory, but you only had 1,000. You know what I mean?
And were those boxes empty?
Some of them were empty. But these were not very good auditors. And it didn't help that Eddie asked his most buxom female employees to assist the auditors by basically climbing up on ladders and calling out to them counts of inventory that were obviously inflated. And these mostly young male auditors were like, how many boobs did you say were in that box? Sorry, I meant boobs. Sorry, I meant boobs. Sorry, I meant microwaves. Sorry. Oh. Eddie's guys would also surreptitiously glance at the auditor's schedule to see which store they'd go to next. And then they would just move all the inventory that they had already counted to that store.
If there was a gold medal in fraud, he'd get the Olympic gold medal.
He said, yeah, Your Honor, I'm slaying. So they'd make many phony invoices from vendors who Eddie would pressure to agree to the scheme. They'd be loosey-goosey with accounting period end, moving transaction from one period into another to boost revenue. And they'd play around with revenue recognition. Some years they'd say they recognized revenue when it was received. Other times they recognized when it was earned. Whatever worked better for them.
So my research, I found while the auditor was distracted, they would change 1s to 4s or 7s in the inventory, which is like just crazy, right? Like this is what you used to do if you got a bad grade on your spelling bee. And then
I like that this worked. Hey, what's that? Scribble, scribble, scribble.
Yeah, literally.
It's like putting the finger down on your chest and going.
Yeah.
Look at those boobs.
Literally.
Seven.
Guys, no giggling. We got a comment the other day that said that our giggling was distracting from incessant giggling.
Fun-free corporate gossip.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Be like my upstairs neighbor who once told me that laughing after 11 is not allowed.
Prohibited.
Yeah.
So the last thing they do, and this was critical before the IPO, is they reduced the amount they skimmed from the store. And this sounds counterintuitive. Why would they want to do that? Sam said, listen, these bankers want to see growth. And if we skim a little less each year, it'll look like we're growing. So they skimmed like $3 million in 1980, $2.5 million in 81, 1.5 in 82, 750 in 83. So it looked like profits were growing every year, and they'd make up the money they skimmed when they IPO'd and were able to cash in on their stocks.
Yeah, the prospectus was like, showed this. It was like crazy growth. It was like 30% a year.
Yeah, 30% a year.
Yeah, that's wild.
And it worked. It worked. Here's a how Crazy Eddie does it. Big volumes, thin margins. Nothing about stealing sales tax. And this is an article from the New York Times the year after they IPO'd in 1985, talking about Crazy Eddie as a business genius.
Yeah, Wall Street analysts just brought into the story, never questioning the numbers and never taking what he said with any degree of skepticism, which would indicate the business was built like a house of cards.
There was a trade magazine called the Wall Street Transcript, which crowned Eddie the third best retail CEO of the year.
I got to tell you, Wall Street's Transcript back in the day was one of the Bibles of Wall Street.
Really, yeah.
And it came out weekly. It was a very thick tab publication, very small type, and it had a great following among the analysts.
And they said he's the third best retail CEO, 2 spots behind Sam Walton.
And who won the lucky IPO race? Who made Crazy Eddie public? Oppenheimer,
which still exists today. I think they're on like 43rd and yeah.
Still a top 10 iBank.
Still a big iBank.
And what was the ticker? Crazy.
CRCY. Great ticker.
Yeah, top 10 ticker.
For sure. I can't think of another ticker that's that good.
There's one of the cannabis companies has weed.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to take a break and then we'll come back with the Boss Boy montage? And we're back. Corporate gossip number 4 is what 1980s Boss Boy montage is complete without 2 chicks named Debbie and a drunken nightclub stabbing? So remember when we talked about Crazy Eddie as a child with a foot in 2 worlds? By the time he's in his late 30s, when Crazy Eddie IPOs, he is firmly on the path that leads to the Times Square peep shows. He's a big partier. One night in the late 1970s, he got in a fight outside a club and was stabbed in the stomach. He survived, but somehow it never made the news. And as you heard in the opening vignette, he's got a wife with whom he shares 4 daughters. Her name is Eddie Antar. On the side, he has a young blonde girlfriend also named Debbie. And we see this a lot with new money CEOs. Oftentimes, the wife just kind of turns a blind eye and accepts that this is part of the deal, which is probably easier to overlook with this upgraded lifestyle provided by your husband's business. Debbie Antar's mother was also on the company payroll, making $75,000 a year, which is a lot in the late 1970s. But Debbie A was, to quote Brittany Cartwright, on the brim of freaking out when Eddie continued to drink and party every night, even once missing the birth of their youngest daughter because he was out partying.
Yeah, it's giving Christopher Moltisanti.
It's not good. After she confronted his adultery on New Year's Eve in 1984, he apparently came home and said, listen, can we just stay married and I'll stay here a few nights a week and spend time with the kids, and then the other nights a week I can stay at Debbie H's house? Apparently she was like, be so fucking for real right now. Absolutely not. And according to the book, he crumpled into the bed and had a full-on temper tantrum for days in response. So here's the story that I was going to tell you guys earlier. You know how Eddie's wife and sister-in-law confronted him on New Year's Eve in the limo when he was waiting for his girlfriend, Debbie.
Yes.
On 80th and 1st. So this is a true story, right before this recording, Dad and I went out to lunch and we just found a random place. We didn't even look at it at all. And I was showing Dad the vignette and we said, oh my God, 80th and 1st. I'm not even kidding. We looked up. Guess where we were?
80th and 1st.
80th and 1st. We were right in front of the apartment building where Eddie and Debbie had their confrontation. Isn't that weird? I guess I'm the only one that thinks it's weird.
No.
Where'd you guys go? Gracie Muse?
Yeah.
Oh, I love Gracie Muse.
Yeah, we were at Gracie Muse, and it was just so strange.
It was just odd. One of the really odd.
Had I known you were going to Gracie Muse, I would have eaten a second lunch.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, you didn't want to come. It was very strange. So anyway, eventually they do agree to a divorce, which I feel kind of bad for Debbie, but she was basically duped into signing a garbage agreement. She got $35,000 a year in maintenance only until her youngest kid turned 21 or until she cohabitated with another man for 3 days or more, whether it was continuous or not. Adam, doesn't that remind you of Lisa Hochstein?
Yeah, it's exactly like hers, but she can't cohabitate with anyone ever.
Yeah.
Like for
these
the
agreements are
remaining...
like made to basically handcuff the wife. But why are you shaking your head?
It's like just like his business. He scammed her.
He totally scammed her, and he kept telling her, "You're gonna get money.
Right.
Don't worry. Just sign this agreement, and you'll get half." And he had no intention.
Because New York has shared property. It'll all be taken. Oh, his famous words. It'll all be taken care of.
Yeah. And she never got a lawyer to look at the papers. She just
imagine trusting Crazy Eddie.
That's the thing. Like, she trusted him, and I don't know why she would.
After your experience with him?
But then again, I mean, we see it on reality TV shows all the time, or anything, right? Where we've seen it in Friends and stuff, where a guy continues again and again to tell you what a piece of crap he is, and the woman just wants to believe that he will do the right thing. They also have 4 daughters together, so I gotta imagine. And according to her, he is a good father, other than not being.
Sure.
Everyone calls him Crazy Eddie, but I know him as Loving Eddie. Yeah. As she cried into her soup.
And just to fully fast forward into the story, she did get an agreement. Like, I think this is in like 2020 or something. This is recent. She did get a settlement for $1.3 million that she was owed, but she's never going to get it, according to the journalist that wrote the story. She's screwed forever. So the thing about this affair and divorce is that it doesn't just impact the immediate family. Remember, this extended family is very closely tied. And they're very closely tied with the business as well. And along with the drinking and the fighting, this all is very embarrassing for the family. And this whole fraud required the entire family to get along. Other family businesses had to sign off on phony invoices. Relatives were depositing cash in the Israeli bank accounts. And beyond that, they had to keep their lips sealed. This messy divorce, it caused a rift in the family, a rift that the House of Cards could not sustain. So for corporate gossip number 5, Adam, I'm hoping you can sing it with me.
The last corporate gossip. No, I will sing it with you.
Okay, ready? 5, 6.
Hold on. Ready? 5, 6, 7, 8.
Karma's a bitch. I should have known better. If I had a wish, I wish I never effed around.
Karma.
That's Jojo Siwa.
That's her ad lib.
That's our interpretation of Jojo Siwa. Okay, so let's get back to the Crazy Eddie business here. And the thing about the way Eddie is doing fraud right now, especially as a public company, is he's basically setting himself up to never be able to not do fraud. This isn't like fake it till you make it, Elizabeth Holmes. The entire value of the organization was built on bullshit. So you really have to work to make sure the tower doesn't topple. Because remember, the way that they made it seem like Crazy Eddie was growing in the first place was to reduce the amount of skimming. So they'd skim 10% less every year, and it looked like Eddie was growing 10% every year. But eventually, they'd run out of money to skim, and by this point, in the years after the IPO, they were actually losing money. So Eddie was getting nervous until he found out something that was going to change everything for him, which was another competing electronics chain wanted to buy Crazy Eddie with a hostile takeover. And by the late 1980s, Crazy Eddie's stock is slumping as their revenue is shrinking, aka they were running out of money to skim. This other electronics company was headed by this 32-year-old Texas businessman named Elias Zinn. He thought this was a golden opportunity. It was just a distressed asset that could be flipped and turned to profit. He goes, this is a quote, "I want to run Crazy Eddie. I think it's a gold mine." This is a quote from the Wall Street Journal article around the time. "The problem with Crazy Eddie," according to him, "was just that the salespeople were rude. That's why revenue was stagnant."
That's the only issue.
That's an MBA for you. He partnered with this finance guy, a reported turnaround expert named Victor Palmieri, to start buying up Crazy Eddie stock for the hostile takeover.
Back in the day, Victor Palmieri was the guy.
Oh, he was famous?
Oh, big, yeah. In the same, today the comparison would be Carl Icahn and Monk.
Really?
Yeah, yes.
Well, this guy did zero dilly-dong. Like, not a speck of due diligence at all. And after they had control of the company, they were like, dude, where's my inventory? Y'all said there was like $127 million worth of inventory, but I'm only counting like $55 million. Like, that's like way less, dude. Eventually, the new owners end up filing for bankruptcy and liquidating all the Crazy Eddie assets, suing Eddie Antar, and the SEC now gets involved, and the Department of Justice, because during Eddie and Debbie's divorce proceedings, because she didn't have a lawyer, she ends up testifying that Eddie avoided sales tax by transferring money overseas. But where is Eddie? We can't find him. Here's his wanted poster. And I love this because, see, it says miscellaneous information. Antar is a wealthy man and frequent international traveler. He has been described as a heavy drinker.
Did you see his alias as Shlomo?
No, I missed that. Where did you? Oh, yeah. Alexander
Joseph
Stewart.
Or Shlomo.
Kelso is, that's like
5'6", 165. This guy was small.
Yeah, he's a tiny guy.
No, but he was buff. He used to work out all the time.
Yeah, he was very buff. And look, it says a 10-inch vertical scar on his abdomen from when he was stabbed.
Did you know that when you are wanted by the U.S. Marshals, they put out your social security number?
Yeah, you know.
No, probably not now. Back in the day, they probably did, but I doubt.
Look, they did it. He's got two social security numbers there.
I doubt they do that now.
I mean, who wants the social security number of a guy who's
yeah, really, if you use that.
Most wanted.
So my guy is pulling a Carlos Ghosn. He fled the country with 6 passports. Get this, $43 million in cash, which apparently he ran out of eventually. And I don't understand how you would have, if you're in hiding. I don't know how you spend that much money.
Manischewitz and cocaine.
I guess so. And a new wife. He married the other Debbie. And he went on the run. He goes to Tel Aviv, Zurich, Sao Paulo, and the Cayman Islands before finally getting arrested in 1992. By the way, Mike, can you tell the story about the way that cops caught him in Israel?
It was perfection. He's cruising around Tel Aviv, and then there's just a stranded motorist, quote unquote, wearing a little tiny skirt with her butt cheeks hanging out. And then obviously Crazy Eddie, he's not regular Eddie. Crazy Eddie went and said, "Let me help you." She said, "Sure, put your hands behind your back." a hot chick sting that took zero planning and effort. They're like, just put some boobs in front of him and he's done.
Apparently he was quoted saying, "That's a great ass." And then
yeah, apparently he went up and grabbed her.
Yeah, he grabbed her ass.
And then she cuffed him.
So funny.
What an idiot. I kind of respect the guy. He was who he was from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
43 million ain't changing
and
old
they
Eddie.
knew exactly. See, that's good police work. They knew
really
exactly
is.
how to get him.
That how many people must have been like, "Dude, this is not going to work. We got a real sting." They're like, "Just let me do this one. If it doesn't work, you can have it." the FBI agents or whatever are clapping as they go into the sting.
I like the documentary because the blonde chick, she like takes off her wig as if to be like, "I'm not a hot blonde chick. I'm a hot brunette." Yeah. It's like,
I'm a hot ginger.
It's like, what does that have to do with anything?
Well, you know,
cops can't be blonde. So here he is, arrested, apprehended. While he's in prison in Israel, he's pulling these extreme acts of histrionics, saying he's so sick and ill, and they're treating him like a dog. There's apparently a 1992 New York Post headline. I couldn't find the actual headline, but I guess it said in all caps, "I'm going to die!" Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. And it read, "Crazy Eddie Antar is wasting on the way in the notorious Ramle prison here. He thinks
Ramle.
It says RMLE. He thinks he is dying. This was worse than the time my wife wouldn't let me live with my mistress." Eventually, he gets extradited when Israel drops their own charges against him, partially because they were like, can you just leave? Like, we don't want you here anymore.
Plus, they took like a ton of his money. They froze a bunch of his accounts. I'm sure they got a piece of that too. They're
Yeah,
like, hey,
maybe.
we'll take a cut. Get him out of here.
So back in the States, he ends up being indicted by a federal jury in Newark. The prosecutors used our favorite legal tool, RICO, which was, as you know, listeners, were created to nail the mob and other organized criminals, but by the 1980s is being used pretty frequently for white-collar crime. We saw it in the incest episode earlier this season. So our hero in the story is actually Cousin Sammy. He was the company's CFO, so his testimony was pretty critical for the government's case. He didn't actually get anything. They didn't give him immunity or anything in exchange for his testimony. Maybe he was hoping, obviously, for a lighter sentence. But I think he was ultimately just trying to do the right thing. And allegedly, according to Sam Antar's Twitter, which we're going to get into at depth later, they threatened him with this. Here's a tweet. He goes, during my plea bargain negotiations, the FBI threatened me that Danny DeVito would play me in future Crazy Eddie movies if I did not cooperate with them. What, do they have a deal with Warner Brothers? Eddie Antar was very Sam Bankman-Fried during this period running up to the trial. He kept giving these self-incriminating interviews, which I find so enjoyable when watching these narcissists in trouble. Here are some quotes that he gave from jail. He goes, I've been charged with a crime I didn't do. And then he goes, sure, I'm not perfect. I've done some things that were wrong, and I'm willing to take responsibility for them. And then the journalist asked, like, what? And he was like, I'm not telling. And he goes, I was not what you would call, I guess, a model citizen or a model person. And guys, what I would give for an Eddie Antar YouTube apology video.
I'm surprised he wasn't going up to the prosecutors like, let me cut you a deal.
Yeah. So eventually, after a guilty verdict and then a retrial, Eddie pled guilty to fraud charges in 1996 and sentenced to 8 years in prison and $150 million in fines, in addition to $1 billion in civil penalties. And you know what's crazy? None of the analysts who hyped him up agreed to take the stand. Nobody from Oppenheimer agreed to get on that witness stand. Nobody who cashed in on their recommendations. They scampered away like little bitches when they were asked to explain to the jury what type of amphetamine cocktail they were on when they printed that buy rating. There have been several attempts to revive the chain, but they've all kind of flopped. Eddie died in 2016 at the age of 68, maybe from liver cancer. It's never really confirmed. Look at these pictures of Sam Antar. He ended up serving 6 months of house arrest and 3 years probation. I think it helps that he didn't end up getting rich from the scheme. He didn't sell any insider stock compared to Eddie, who dumped like $80 million in stock in the run up to the fraud being exposed. Sam went on to become a public figure. He speaks to colleges and classrooms and accounting seminars about fraud. He got his CPA license revoked, obviously, but he still does some forensic accounting, and he's a consultant. So this is crazy. There was a CNBC sit down, which honestly was more like a Real Housewives of New Jersey reunion than a daytime business special. They let Sammy confront Eddie for the first time. Have you guys watched this?
I've seen it.
So
Yes.
I haven't seen the actual end of it, so I kind of want to go just to the end and have us watch this.
Blame to anybody else other than myself.
Eddie may not blame Sam for the time he spent behind bars, but Sam certainly holds Eddie accountable to a large extent for how his life turned out.
You brought us up to be crooks, Eddie. You taught everything I became came from you, Eddie. Okay? Now, I don't blame myself, but everything I became, I learned from you.
You didn't just learn from me. We learned we learned.
Yes, the
like
culture.
you learned. We learned the culture.
That's right.
So it's not what I taught you. You knew the culture.
Good.
So do not sit there and, by the way, do not raise your voice to me.
I can like feel Sam's frustration in that. Like, this guy's a narcissist. Eddie is a narcissist for sure. What do you guys think when you watch that interaction?
It seems that Eddie won't take any blame.
Yeah. Are you guys ready to move to the takeaways?
Yeah.
And I think we're going to kind of continue this conversation. Do you guys agree? Do you think that Eddie was predisposed to fraud? And like, what about Sam? What do you think about him?
Okay, so there's a great quote from the counsel for the investors, and he says, "The Crazy Eddie saga, it's the Sephardic Jewish Goodfellas," which I think is just the best way to summarize the story. But I feel really bad for Sam and the rest of the family, because I think the rest of the family got screwed, and they Eddie was the ringleader, and so many times we cover stories that we say, oh, well, one bad apple ruins the bunch, where in this case it really was one bad apple that ruined the bunch. Like, if you take Eddie out of the story, I don't think that it was I don't think they would have gone and done so much fraud, right? When I look at Sam now, he's really remorseful. Seems really upset about what he did, and maybe it was the penal system that did him right. And when he's talking about, I wronged investors, I wronged our employees, I wronged my family. He just goes on and talks about all the people he's wronged. And now he's dedicated his life to commenting on fraud, or in his mind, stopping fraud, on his blog, whitecollarcrime.com. I think he's a dream guest for us. And he's my Frank Abagnale Jr.
So I don't agree that the family was screwed. I think they very much enabled Eddie. I think Eddie had an addiction to scamming, much like any other addiction. And I think just like if you're dealing with a family member has a problem, you need to set boundaries and you need to say, like, hey, I'm not going to support this behavior. The problem is, like I was saying before, they benefited from it.
Yeah, that's the thing. He made them wealthy.
I know. So I don't think they got screwed, though, in that sense.
I think it was easy money, and if everyone around them is doing it...
Yes, that's the thing.
That's an issue, and Eddie's the one who's dangling the prize right in front of them. They're like, here, this is how it is to get easy to get rich. Why don't you guys try it? If you take Eddie out of the equation, who's to say they would still be fraudulent?
And don't forget, Crazy Eddie was at the top of the hill.
Yeah.
I mean, they ruled the roost back in that time. I mean, everybody knew who Crazy Eddie was. You said you were CFO from Crazy Eddie. Everyone went gaga.
That's what I'm saying. That's from the beginning. I said it's really hard to do the right thing when you're being paid to do the wrong thing.
Right.
And I think that's a quote. There's a quote that I read that's very similar to that. And I'm sure I didn't make up that theory, but listeners, let us know what you think. Like, if you come from like a big tight-knit family and you knew that somebody was committing like a widespread fraud, I bet it would be really hard to separate yourself from that. I bet you would be really hard to call that out and not participate in it.
Especially if you're benefiting.
Especially if you're, that's tough. Mike, any takeaways? We're going to move to something different, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, Crazy Eddie was the ringleader, and everyone else knew that it was wrong, but Eddie was making piles of money and their family, and you just want to jump in on that. It's tough. Yeah, I mean, if they did it wrong, they did their time or got penalized, and yeah, Eddie was the man in charge, and moral of the story, I want to be Eddie. I was telling you the other night,
Yeah.
I'm like, I feel like in my bones, because I come from a family like 2 generations back of grifters, bar owners that stole money, gamblers, fell off the back of the truckers type of people. I think I'm like 1 or 2 moral compass ticks away from like wanting to be Eddie. Like, I can feel it on my bones sometimes. I was telling you, if you were like, hey, what do you think about a little fraud? Like, I think that's all I would need to be like, all right, let's do it. But obviously it's wrong. Don't ever do fraud.
Exactly, yeah. And if you're confused, go back like 20 minutes and listen to our chant.
Do fraud.
So yeah, Adam, you mentioned we're going to end the episode with a little bit of fun. We talked about Sam going on speaking tours and how important auditing and professional skepticism are, and I'm totally here for that. The auditors totally dropped the ball. Adam, you said he's accounting's Frank Abagnale, and you're absolutely right. Here's a tweet. He said, and he comments on different frauds that are happening now. He says, I didn't stop doing crime because of a sudden moral awakening. I stopped doing crime because I was caught. If I hadn't been caught, I could have been a bigger criminal than Sam Bankman-Fried. The lack of accountability leads to more crime. So he's being honest about like where his mindset was during the crime. I will say, Adam, you said he was a dream guest. I don't know about that. The rest of his Twitter is pretty unhinged. I pulled a lot of funny stuff. It's just a lot of cringe boomer political takes that kind of make me go like, yikes. But that's for a different podcast. But for the record, he also thinks that Elon Musk is a massive scammer, which I think says something. But here are the funniest tweets that I pulled. After the New York City earthquake a few weeks ago, he goes, "I've rounded up my old Crazy Eddie team to do an earthquake claim. We estimate $1 million in damages." And everybody knows the earthquake, there was no damages. Here he goes. He's talking about the measurement lines on a Solo cup, and he goes, "I don't know anything about measurement lines on a Solo cup, but I do know that it took at most 3 martinis to get the auditors plastered and compromise their integrity." He literally thinks he's Rodney Dangerfield. Adam, I feel like you'll like this one. Here are the top 5 worst things to happen in New York City. Number 1, 9/11. Number 2, Crazy Eddie closing. Number 3, progressives. Number 4, Bill de Blasio. And number 5, cyclists. You guys want to hear a crazy story? Okay. Another Sam Antar, not the Sam Antar that we were talking about, but this guy, Eddie's nephew, in 2019, was arrested for stealing nearly $800,000 from investors in New Jersey and New York and using much of the money to gamble. In turn, he sued MGM, saying that they preyed on his gambling addiction by giving him repeated cash bonuses and intended to keep him gambling, which I have heard about. I heard about that story on NPR. That's legitimate, but I don't know. When your last name is Antar, I think you need to be a little suspicious of those claims. So, okay, we've come to the end of the Crazy Eddie episode. Dad, I realize I never gave you a chance to kind of say the last word, so I think that'll be a good opportunity for you to do your last reflections on Crazy Eddie.
Thank you. There was not an accounting fraud he didn't participate in. Every possible way, every possible scam. But what's interesting here is Sam's involvement. He went to Baruch for accounting. Baruch is a respected accounting school, and as you well know, ethics is pounded into you through the CPA program. And no matter what he learned from the top accounting professors, he just went totally out to left field and said, "I'm in it for the long run."
No, I think that shows the influence of family and culture and expectations and all. Like, they probably didn't talk about that in accounting school.
You think that just because you have a CPA means you're ethical?
I do.
That's what I'm interested in tapping on, is that you think, oh, because the CPA harners so much on ethics.
So I've talked about this before in the podcast, which is
the CPA is a test.
No, but you need to be primed to recognize when you're getting into fraud territory, and the CPA allows you to do that.
I agree.
And you're supposed to understand how to have professional skepticism. Like, I'm not saying that people who have CPAs are more ethical, but I am saying that they are able to key into unethical behavior when they see it a lot earlier than somebody else would be able to. They'd have to still choose whether they're going to endeavor in the fraud or not. Of course, they're humans with free will, but Dad's right. I mean, I think it goes to show that it doesn't matter. You can still have the pressures of family. This is a family business. This isn't, he's not working at Walmart where they had controls. There was no controls here. He should have known, but he didn't. And that, I think, probably plays into his guilt.
The other thing you got to take away is whenever anything is hyped up,
yes,
be suspect. Just like Elizabeth Holmes, magazines covers, being worshipped by the financial press.
Look, we talked in this podcast. We've covered 3 people who were on the cover of Forbes: Elizabeth Holmes, what's his face from Incest, who I'm blanking on his name right now, and Sam Bankman-Fried.
Right.
I mean, that means nothing. And Elon Musk, who we'll cover in a future episode.
And Enron?
Enron's on the cover of Forbes.
Yeah,
I mean, the hype, I agree, is a total red flag.
Exactly.
And it's really easy to get sucked into it, especially when you have analysts or people who are paid to give their professional opinions, giving dog shit opinions based on nothing.
Because
based on
they may
dream.
be conflicted too.
Because they make money off of it too.
They make a ton of money off it. So watch for the hype and be wary of the magazine covers.
Well, Dad, thanks. I think that we did get possessed by the ghost of Eddie Antar standing in the spot where he was waiting for his girlfriend many
Where he
years
got
ago
into a fight with
his sister. Dad and I actually recreated the scene, and so I'll upload that on Instagram, and you can see that picture there. But yeah, that was fun. Thanks for coming. I think this was a perfect episode for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thanks for all the shout outs from our listeners. I really appreciate it.
You have a Twitter to plug?
At Jeff Platsky.
How are the ludes wearing off?
Yeah, the ludes are short acting. Thank you.
Do you have anything else to plug?
And floss daily, guys.
Great.
All right. If you want to follow us, you can do so at Corporate Gossip Pod on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. Don't forget, guys, we're on YouTube this year. Well, we're on YouTube all the time, but this year we have like kind of enhanced editing thanks to producer Mike. So I think it'll be a much better viewing experience than maybe it was last year. And if you want to support the pod, you can do so by buying us a coffee, emailing us, Becca@nighttoast.com or Adam@nighttoast.com. Until then, we'll see you next week.